Welcome back to We Get Macro. We're going to continue learning about macroeconomics. So now we're going to dive into the national debt and the idea of what fiscal policy does to the economy through the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. Okay, so the idea here is, of course, you've heard, and maybe you haven't, and that's completely okay. I incentivize you to do so now. Just go on Google or different types of newspapers and search for debt, national debt, and see what comes up in terms of news, so you can get an idea about what's been talking about. Okay, but the idea here is that the debt in the U.S. has grown over time. We're going to understand how that has happened. So we've talked about budget deficits and budget surpluses. We know the surplus is when we have more revenue than we expenditures, and deficits when we spend more money than we raise in terms of revenue. In terms of the government, that will be when we spend more money than we raise in terms of taxes, right? So in this case here, whenever the graph shows you a curve, the curve is below zero, would be a deficit, okay, which means the government needed to borrow money to be able to fund all of the activities for that year. Okay, of course, as we saw in the previous graph, during the last video, the World War II is a big impact on that. Right? But also know that we increased taxes a lot after that, and you can see how we had a surplus after that helped us pay a little bit of that. Okay, so the cyclical movements are definitely going to influence the budget of the government, both federal, especially federal, since the state has a balanced budget. Okay, as you can see here, the national budget, the national deficit only increased over time. Now, to better get an idea about how that has changed, instead of looking at nominal terms, once again, we're going to compare relative to the size of the economy over time. You can see it's still been extremely higher. Okay, so that GDP ratio is a really good way to look at it. Okay, now you can see here, this is not in that way. This is in nominal terms, just to give an idea about the size of that increase over time, which is incredible, right? There's a lot of that. Now the matter is this important? Is this going to be detrimental for economic activity in the U.S.? Right. That's the question. Can we raise surpluses over time to be able to pay this back? Right. So the idea here is that and you can see here, this is the debt to GDP ratio as the blue line, and you can see the red is still the surpluses and deficits over years. Okay, and you can see that whenever we have surpluses, we tend to pay some of it back, but it's not required. Okay, whenever we get a surplus, we get to decide whether we need to reinvest that money into the economy if it's a recession for some reason and we have that money left over, or if we pay back our debt. Okay, so that's the idea here. And you can see that now our debt level is even higher than our size of our economy. In other words, not even if we get the whole size of economic output this year, we would not be able to pay our entire debt, the debt of the country. Okay, so you can really see here how business cyclicality have impacted the budget deficit and surplus, but you can see that the U.S. has run a deficit over time, right? And the idea of that is that if you add the budget deficits over time, you get the total debt in the economy once you subtract anything that you paid back in terms of surpluses. Okay, so to reduce the debt GDP ratio, which is if it's a goal of the government, either we grow faster and then we can pay that sum, which would be a lower share of our overall economy, or we increase revenue and lower expenditures so we can have more surpluses, right? But the question is, once again, how big can that GDP ratio get before an economy suffer consequences? Okay, so that's extremely important to think about because that will definitely impact how our economy develops over time. Okay, so here's a good question. If the government ends up with a budget surplus at the end of the year, is it required to pay back debt? Just think about that for a second. Will it use the surplus to pay deficit without a doubt? Will it definitely use the surplus to give more government expenditure and promote growth? Or will the current government goals and economic scenario determine what the surplus is be spent upon? In other words, if it's a recession, maybe we apply back to the economy. If we're going through economic boom, maybe we pay back that. Or D, it will use the surplus to increase the money supply through open market operations. Hopefully here you notice the money supply is related to monetary policy. So that's definitely out, right? We'll also know that you use the surplus to increase government spending, promote growth. It's very similar to, it's the completely opposite of using the surplus to pay out debt. So the question is, do we have to pay out debt? Do we promote growth? Or it depends on the economy? A, B, or C? And as you know, since the federal government does not have a balanced budget requirement, it depends on the economy. It depends on what they decide to do. Now, if states had a surplus, they would definitely use that to pay back debt from the previous year, right? Because they're going to have the surplus. It's a planned surplus because they needed to be able to pay back debt from the previous year. So you can see the difference between the laws related to federal and state and local governments, right? Another thing that's very important I'm going to talk about here in this fiscal policy scenario is the Social Security scenario, right? As I said, that's a program that is funded by young individuals those are funding the elderly individuals that are receiving their retirement and Social Security now, right? But what if the share of the population that's older relative to the younger has changed? For example, think about the baby boomers, right? The baby boomers in 1946, one American 13 was of age 65. But by 2030, the projections are 1 in 5. Look at that change in the proportion of elderlies relative to the young individuals. People have less kids, and also people that had a lot of kids back in the day, those are all getting older now, right? If they're not having more kids, then you can see how it's really hard to fund those elderlies now because there's less people working to fund that. So then do you raise taxes, but now you disincentivizing work, and you're funding the elderly, but they didn't contribute enough. Oh, now you have all those debates. They contributed enough for when they could, based on what government thought they should. Maybe now we should fund them so they can have some money. You can see the big political questions that get raised once we start talking about fiscal monetary policies, right? But the baby boom generations, this is something that is impacting the Social Security now. And it's being predicted that's going to be trouble for us trying to fund those individuals and retirees moving forward, especially by 2030. Okay, so something to think about as we move forward in our lives is maybe we need to make sure that we save some retirement because we can depend on what the government's going to give us. What if that program ends because they don't have enough funds? We never know, right? So what are some options to try to solve the Social Security issue? Increase taxes, increase revenue, so we have more money to be able to fund those programs. Is that popular though when you're trying to get voted and elected? No. Cut government spending. Well, but if government spending is related to infrastructure projects, people are losing jobs. Is that popular? No. Oh, so let's lower salaries of government workers. Is that popular? Also no. So you can see it's really tough to increase anything that relates to surplus because it requires less spending now and more savings for the future, and more savings that goes towards the government, right? Not the ones that we keep in our bank, right? So you can see the difficulty in trying to promote these types of policies, right? Maybe increase the retirement age. People die a lot later now, so let's just do like you need to be 80 to be able to get this. Imagine you're 1 year away from 65 to earn this retirement, and you paid your whole life, you contributed your whole life, then you just hear that you're not going to get it. Not popular either. How can you go to try to get elected through those types of policies? It's tough. It's tough, especially when a higher share of the population is now older, right? They're voting too. Or we can allow the government to just keep running a deficit and acquiring more debt, and at least we can fund our activities. So far, this has been what we've been following. Maybe because it's really hard to make one of the other two decisions. Maybe that's because that's the solution right now. So something to think about in terms of what are the other options besides acquiring debt. And I incentivize you to have your own view about this, to think about the consequences of both. Okay. So now I really, really incentivize you to stop this and go check about how fiscal policy fights recessions, unemployment, and inflation, this margin revolution video. Okay. And on the next slides, we're going to invest how fiscal policy can impact economic activity. And then we're going to be able to conclude the chapter in the last slides. Okay, so the expansionary fiscal policy here in this case, we're going to be talking about the government trying to incentivize the economy through a recession. Okay, so in this case, there's two things to consider here. Either we can decrease taxes, right, which would give more money in the hands of the population to then be able to consume and invest more, right? Or we can change government spending as well. Okay, the scenario I'm showing here is government spending, but the decrease in taxes would work in a very similar way. It just depends who would get the tax. Right. So in this case, an increase in government spending would cause aggregate demand is the GDP equation once again. So C plus I plus G plus NX. And given that this is done properly, right, that those workers that those infrastructure projects are employing are actually people that are unemployed. They're not stealing people from the private sector, right? Then that would impact the aggregate demand. If government spending goes up, then we can see the aggregate demand going up. Okay, I incentivize you to do this on your own as well. But if we decrease taxes, for example, we decrease the income tax, then now people have more money for expenditures, would also cause aggregate demand to go up. Okay, so analyze how this other type of our fiscal policy tool can be done when done through taxes as well. And let me know if you have any questions. Okay, that's a really good exercise. Okay, so the idea here is that if there's an increase in government spending, you're going to focus on that example, and that, as we talked about in the previous slide, that's going to increase aggregate demand. Okay, so that at the same price level, you can see that we would be able to acquire more goods and services, demand more goods and services, right? Because there's more government spending, which increases one of the components of the aggregate demand, and that leads to a potential higher inflation, but also higher output. Okay, so expansionary policy seen there, right? So unemployment goes down, inflation potentially can go up, right? And you can see that we're growing given the economic stimulus, okay? Okay, so what about contractionary policy? Now we see as the opposite. Once again, I'm gonna show here the scenario in terms of decrease in government spending, but I incentivize you to try to do the second one on your own. So imagine there's an increase in the income tax. Imagine there's an increase on the payroll tax. Think about how that would change the aggregate demand, okay? But in the terms of the decrease in government spending, once again, government spending is part of GDP, right? So if GDP is going to go down due to the aggregate demand going down, then we know that aggregate demand is going to shift to the left, is going to decrease. And that's exactly what we see, right? At every price level, at the same price level, there will be a lower demand, a lower aggregate demand for goods and services. Why? Because government's not spending that money, okay? So that's the case here, is that now we see the opposite. Inflation tends to be lower and output tends to go down, which tends to increase unemployment. So you can think, just like we did in monetary policy, we're connecting how changes in aggregate demand through now changes in fiscal policy rather than changes in monetary policy can impact unemployment, inflation, and output growth. Okay, so moving forward, on the last videos, we're going to talk about the automatic stabilizers, some of the pitfalls of fiscal policy. So stay tuned, and please, as always, let me know if you have any questions. I'd love to hop in on a Zoom chat or in the virtual class and get to answer all the questions that you have about these concepts.